I opened my front door one quiet Saturday morning, coffee in hand, only to find a gleaming silver SUV sitting smack in the middle of my driveway. And there she was, HOA Karen, standing proudly beside it, arms crossed, daring me to say something. Two ewes. Morning had started like any other in Willowbrook Estates. The air carried that crisp autumn scent of freshly cut grass and decomposing leaves, the kind of peaceful silence that makes you grateful for suburban life. Birds chirped from the oak trees lining our street, and the only sound had been the gentle hum of my coffee maker brewing my morning fuel. That tranquility shattered the moment I stepped onto my front porch. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The silver Escalade, Karen's pride and joy, was parked perpendicular across my driveway entrance, its chrome bumper gleaming in the morning sun like a barricade. The engine was still running, exhaust fumes creating small clouds in the cool air, as if she'd just pulled up moments before I emerged. But it wasn't the blocked driveway that made my blood pressure spike. It was her. Karen Westfield stood beside her SUV like a general surveying conquered territory. Mid-50s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair that never moved in wind or rain, wearing her usual uniform of pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. Her arms were crossed, her chin lifted at that particular angle that screamed, "I dare you to challenge me." And those designer sunglasses she always wore perched on her head like a crown. The coffee mug in my hand trembled slightly as the full weight of the situation hit me. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't someone who'd gotten lost or confused about parking. The way she positioned herself, the deliberate blocking of my entire driveway width, the fact that she was just standing there watching my house, this was intentional. "Good morning, Michael," she called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She didn't move from her position, didn't offer any explanation, just stood there like blocking someone's driveway was the most natural thing in the world. I set my coffee down on the porch railing and walked closer, my bare feet cold against the concrete. Each step sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through my system. This was bold, even for Karen. In the 3 years since I'd moved to Willowbrook Estates, she'd made my life difficult in dozens of petty ways, but nothing this brazen. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest, "your car is blocking my driveway." She adjusted her sunglasses and smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the kind predators give their prey. "Is it? I hadn't noticed." The lie hung in the air between us. She hadn't noticed? The woman who measured grass height with a ruler, who walked the neighborhood with a clipboard documenting every minor violation, who once called an emergency HOA meeting because someone's garden gnome was 2 inches too close to the sidewalk. That woman hadn't noticed she'd parked across someone's entire driveway? "I need to get to work," I said, gesturing toward my own car trapped in the garage behind her SUV. She tapped one perfectly manicured finger against her crossed arms. "That does sound like a problem." That's when I realized this wasn't just rudeness. This wasn't even standard HOA power tripping. This was something else entirely. A deliberate escalation, a line being crossed. She wasn't here to deliver another violation notice or complain about my lawn. She was here to send a message. The morning air suddenly felt colder. A dog barked in the distance, and somewhere a lawnmower started up. But our little corner of the street felt isolated, like we were the only 2 people in the world. Karen continued to stand there, immovable, waiting. I looked at her SUV again, noting how precisely she'd positioned it. Not just blocking one side of my driveway, the entire width. She'd had to carefully maneuver to achieve that level of obstruction. This had required planning, intention, malice. "You can't just block people's driveways, Karen. Can't I?" She tilted her head, studying me like a scientist examining a specimen. "We'll see about that." The threat in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't about parking or HOA rules or neighborhood standards. This was about power. Her power over me, over everyone on this street. She'd been building to this moment, testing boundaries, seeing how far she could push before someone pushed back. Standing there in my bare feet and pajama pants, holding a coffee mug like some suburban warrior's shield, I felt something shift inside me. The anger was still there, hot and immediate. But underneath it was something colder, more calculating. She wanted to play games? She wanted to see who would blink first? I looked into her eyes, or rather at my own reflection in her designer sunglasses, and saw something that made my stomach clench. This wasn't the end of whatever twisted game she'd been playing with me. This was just the beginning. She'd been nibbling around the edges for months, testing my limits with increasingly bold harassment. But blocking my driveway? That was a declaration of war. She wasn't just trying to annoy me anymore. She was trying to trap me, to make me feel helpless in my own home. As I stood there in the morning cold, watching her smug smile widen, I felt something crystallize in my mind. The anger? Yes, but also a strange kind of calm. She thought she held all the cards. She thought her HOA position made her untouchable. She thought I was just another neighbor who would bend to her will. Rather than fight back, she wanted a war. She just didn't know who she was up against. "Do you know who I am?" she hissed, leaning on her SUV. "I'm the one who decides what happens on this street." Those words still echoed in my head an hour later, as I sat at my kitchen table, my untouched breakfast growing cold while I stared out the window at her silver barricade. Karen had finally moved her car, after making me wait 45 minutes, but not before delivering that chilling declaration of ownership over our entire neighborhood. To understand what happened that morning, you need to understand Karen Westfield. She wasn't born the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates. She'd crowned herself, one petty power grab at a time. Karen had moved to our neighborhood 5 years ago, a recently divorced real estate agent with too much time and a desperate need to control something, anything, in her life. Within 6 months, she'd maneuvered herself onto the HOA board. Within a year, she was president. And within 2 years, she'd transformed from a neighbor into a tyrant. The woman was 53 years old, but fought aging like it was a personal enemy. Every hair was in place, every outfit pressed and coordinated, every nail perfectly manicured. She drove that silver Escalade like it was a throne room on wheels, and she treated our quiet suburban street like her personal kingdom. But it was her psychology that made her truly dangerous. Karen didn't just want to enforce rules, she wanted to create them constantly, arbitrarily, as tools to maintain her power. The HOA handbook had tripled in size under her reign, filled with increasingly specific and bizarre regulations that seemed designed to trap residents in violations. Mrs. Henderson had been fined $200 for using the wrong shade of beige paint on her shutters. The approved HOA color was warm camel, but she'd used desert sand, which Karen declared was clearly too yellow and therefore non-compliant. The fact that the two colors were virtually indistinguishable didn't matter. Karen had a paint chip sample, and that made her right. The Johnsons received a violation notice because their grass was 3.2 inches tall instead of the maximum allowed 3 inches. Karen had measured it personally with a ruler on her hands and knees in front of half the neighborhood. The $150 fine was due within 10 days. No appeals allowed. Old Mr. Peterson got written up for unapproved seasonal decorations because his Halloween pumpkins were still on his porch on November 3rd. Never mind that the man was 82 and had been in the hospital. Karen's rules stated decorations must be removed within 48 hours of any holiday, and she intended to enforce that to the minute. The stories went on and on. Garden gnomes confiscated for being too whimsical. Wind chimes banned for creating noise pollution. Flower beds deemed inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics and ordered removed. She'd even tried to regulate the breeds of dogs people could own, claiming that anything larger than 30 pounds was potentially disruptive to property values. But her masterpiece of petty tyranny was the mailbox incident. Karen had decided that all mailboxes in the neighborhood should be identical. Same height, same color, same style. Never mind that people had spent hundreds of dollars on their existing mailboxes, or that there was nothing in the original HOA charter about mailbox uniformity. Karen had declared it necessary for visual harmony, and that was final. When the Garcias refused to replace their beautiful custom-built mailbox, a wedding gift from Mrs. Garcia's late father, Karen had it removed in the middle of the night. Not just removed, but destroyed, cut up with power tools, and left in pieces on their lawn. The accompanying note informed them they had 48 hours to install an approved replacement or face daily fines of $50. That's when I realized what I was really dealing with. This wasn't just someone on a power trip. This was someone who had crossed the line from authority into pure sadism. She enjoyed the fear, the helplessness, the way people's voices got quiet when they talked about her. She fed on it. The worst part was how she'd isolated herself as the sole decision-maker. The other HOA board members were either too intimidated to challenge her or had been carefully selected for their willingness to rubber stamp her decisions. Board meetings had become Karen's personal theater, where she would announce new rules and levy new fines, while everyone else sat in nervous silence. I'd bought my house in Willowbrook Estates because it was supposed to be peaceful. A quiet street, lined with oak trees, neighbors who waved when they saw you, the kind of place where you could relax after a long day at work. My little two-story colonial with its blue shutters and white picket fence had felt like a dream come true. But Karen had slowly turned that dream into a nightmare. It started small, a notice about my trash cans being improperly aligned with the curb. Then a warning about my lawn being inconsistent in color because of a small brown patch near the mailbox. Each violation notice was typed in official language, printed on HOA letterhead, and delivered with the solemnity of a court summons. The psychological warfare was deliberate and effective. She made you feel like you were constantly being watched, constantly one mistake away from punishment. Every morning, I found myself scanning my property for potential violations before leaving for work. Every evening, I'd check for new notices taped to my door. She'd turned homeownership from a source of pride into a source of anxiety. The morning she blocked my driveway wasn't the first time she'd crossed me personally. 3 months earlier, she'd tried to have my fence painted approved sage green instead of the white I'd chosen. When I pointed out that the HOA charter said nothing about fence colors, she'd created a new rule on the spot. 2 weeks after that, she'd declared my bird feeder non-compliant wildlife attraction equipment and demanded its removal. But I'd stood my ground on those issues, politely but firmly refusing to comply with her arbitrary demands. Maybe that's what had escalated things. Maybe she'd decided I was a problem that needed to be solved more directly. Neighbors had warned me. "Don't fight her," Mrs. Chen had whispered over the hedge one evening. "She'll ruin you." Just give her what she wants, and maybe she'll leave you alone. But I'd seen what giving her what she wants looked like. It looked like Mr. Peterson, afraid to put up Christmas lights. It looked like the Hendersons, repainting their house for the third time in 2 years. It looked like the Garcias, standing in their yard, staring at the pieces of their destroyed mailbox. That morning, standing in my driveway while she blocked my path to work, I'd made a decision that had been building for months. I wasn't going to live in fear of Karen Westfield. I wasn't going to let her turn my home into her prison. That morning, I decided I wasn't going to play by her rules anymore. When I tried to leave for work, I found not just her SUV, but a stack of HOA violation notices taped across my front door. The paper crinkled as I peeled the notices away from my door, the industrial-strength tape pulling at the paint. 7 separate violations, each printed on official HOA letterhead, each demanding immediate attention and substantial fines. The sharp chemical smell of the tape adhesive made my nose burn. But that was nothing compared to the bitter taste of realization settling in my mouth. This wasn't random harassment anymore. This was systematic warfare. I stood on my front porch in the morning cold, scanning through the ridiculous charges while my coffee grew cold inside. Unapproved mailbox positioning. Apparently, my mailbox was now 2.3 inches too far from the curb. Non-compliant exterior lighting. The motion sensor light by my garage was allegedly creating light pollution for neighbors. Irregular lawn maintenance patterns, because the stripes from my mower didn't run in perfectly straight lines. The most absurd one claimed my trash cans were positioned in a way that was aesthetically disruptive to the street view. Never mind that I'd placed them exactly where the garbage company required them, in the same spot every neighbor used. Karen had decided they were wrong, and therefore, they were wrong. Each violation came with a fine ranging from $75 to $200, totaling nearly $900 in penalties, all due within 10 days, with daily compounding interest if not paid promptly. At the bottom of each notice, in small print, was the threat that gave Karen her real power. Failure to comply may result in legal action and/or liens against the property. I crumpled the papers in my fist, anger building like steam in a pressure cooker. This was retaliation, pure and simple. I'd dared to question her authority that morning, had refused to be intimidated by her driveway blockade, and now she was, hitting back with everything in her arsenal, but she was just getting started. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. Karen seemed to have made tormenting me her full-time job, and she approached it with the dedication of a zealot. First came the surveillance. I'd catch glimpses of her Escalade parked just around the corner, positioned where she could watch my house without being obvious about it. Sometimes she'd sit there for hours, and I swear I could see the glint of binoculars in the front seat. When I left for work, she'd follow me to the end of the neighborhood, just close enough to send a message. When I came home, there she'd be again, watching. Then came the visitors. Suddenly, Willowbrook Estates was apparently the most popular place in town for out-of-town guests. Every day, different cars would park strategically near my driveway, never quite blocking it but close enough to make backing out a careful maneuver. The cars would sit there for hours, sometimes overnight, their owners nowhere to be seen. When I tried to trace the plates, I discovered they belonged to Karen's friends, relatives, even her real estate clients. She was using every connection. She had to create a constant low-level harassment campaign, death by 1,000 paper cuts. The violation notices kept coming, each one more petty than the last. My garden hose was improperly stored because it was coiled instead of hung on a rack. My newspaper delivery was creating litter because sometimes the paper landed 2 inches past the perfect center of my walkway. Even my choice of lawn fertilizer was somehow non-compliant with neighborhood environmental standards. But it was at the monthly community meeting that Karen revealed the true scope of her campaign. I'd started attending these meetings after the harassment began, partly to defend myself and partly to understand what I was really up against. They were held in the community center's small conference room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while Karen held court from behind a folding table stacked with binders and legal documents. That night, there were maybe 15 neighbors present, the usual crowd of retirees and stay-at-home parents who either supported Karen or were too intimidated to oppose her. I sat in the back, trying to blend in while she worked through her agenda of new rules and enforcement actions. "Now," Karen announced, adjusting her reading glasses as she flipped through her papers, "we need to discuss the ongoing compliance issues on Maple Street." Everyone in the room knew she was talking about me, though she maintained the pretense of not using names. She laid out my supposed violations with the precision of a prosecutor, complete with photographs and measurements. The mailbox positioning, the lawn care patterns, the improper placement of trash cans. She documented everything. But then she said something that made my blood freeze. "This homeowner has shown a pattern of non-compliance and defiance that threatens the very foundation of our community standards," she declared, her voice carrying that tone of righteous authority she'd perfected. "If we allow this behavior to continue, it sends a message that our rules are optional, that individual residents can simply ignore the collective agreements that maintain our property values." She paused, looking around the room to make sure everyone was listening. "He'll either bend or he'll move. Those are his options." The words hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just trying to punish me for my defiance. She was trying to force me out of my home entirely. This wasn't about mailboxes or lawn care or any of the petty violations she'd manufactured. This was about power, pure and simple. She wanted to make an example of me, to show every other resident what happened when you dared to challenge Karen Westfield. Looking around the room, I saw the faces of my neighbors, and what I saw there broke my heart. Fear, resignation, relief that it was me in Karen's crosshairs instead of them. These were good people, decent people, but they'd been systematically broken down by years of harassment and intimidation. Mrs. Chen wouldn't make eye contact. The Hendersons studied their hands. Even Mr. Peterson, who'd lived in this neighborhood longer than anyone, just stared at the table in silence. Karen had turned a community into a collection of frightened individuals, too scared to speak up, too isolated to resist. That night, driving home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook Estates, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to bend, and I sure as hell wasn't going to move. If Karen wanted a war, she'd have one. But first, I needed to understand exactly who I was fighting. And more importantly, I needed to find her weaknesses. Because everyone has weaknesses, even self-appointed neighborhood dictators. I just had to be smart enough to find them, patient enough to document them, and strategic enough to use them. The game was changing, and Karen had no idea what was coming. What Karen didn't know was that I wasn't just another homeowner. I had something she could never control. A hidden ace up my sleeve. I spent that weekend after the community meeting doing what I should have done months ago. Fighting back with the same methodical precision that Karen used to terrorize everyone else. But unlike her arbitrary rule-making and petty harassment, my approach would be grounded in something she'd apparently forgotten about: actual law. See, Karen made one crucial mistake in sizing me up. She assumed I was just another suburban dad who'd cave under pressure. another neighbor who'd rather pay bogus fines than fight back. What she didn't know was that before I'd moved to Willowbrook Estates, I'd spent 8 years as a paralegal specializing in property law and HOA disputes. I knew exactly how these organizations were supposed to work, what powers they actually had, and more importantly, what they couldn't legally do, no matter how official their letterhead looked. That Saturday night, I spread Karen's violation notices across my dining room table and started dissecting them with the eye of someone who'd seen this playbook before. The results were even better than I'd hoped. Every single violation was either legally meaningless or improperly documented. The mailbox positioning? There was no enforceable HOA rule about exact distances from the curb. And even if there was, she'd never followed proper notification procedures. The lighting complaint? Motion sensor lights were specifically protected under county safety ordinances. The lawn care patterns? Not even mentioned in our actual HOA charter. But the real gold mine was hidden in the language itself. Karen had been so confident in her authority that she'd made fundamental legal errors in nearly every document. Improper notice periods, missing, documentation requirements, fines that exceeded the HOA's chartered authority. It was a systematic pattern of overreach that could invalidate years of her decisions. I pulled out my laptop and started what would become weeks of meticulous documentation. Every violation notice I'd received, every arbitrary rule she'd created, every fine she'd levied. I began building a database of Karen's overreach with timestamps, photographs, and legal analysis. The camera work started that very night. I'd invested in a discreet security system months earlier, partly for home protection but now repurposed for evidence gathering. Every time Karen drove by to watch my house, every time one of her visitor friends parked near my driveway, every time she trespassed on my property to measure my grass or inspect my mailbox, it was all being recorded in high definition. By Tuesday, I had 47 separate instances of Karen either harassing me directly or coordinating harassment through others. The timestamps painted a picture of obsessive behavior that went far beyond normal HOA enforcement. But documentation was only half the battle. The other half was understanding the system itself, and that's where my legal background became invaluable. Spent hours that week reading through our HOA's original charter, the county records of its establishment, and the state laws governing homeowner associations. What I discovered was a pattern of systematic rulemaking that violated the HOA's own governing documents. Karen had been creating emergency policies that bypassed the required board approval process. She'd been levying fines that exceeded the amount specified in the original charter. Most importantly, she'd been enforcing rules that had never been properly ratified according to the HOA's own procedural requirements. It was a house of cards, built on intimidation and the assumption that no one would ever challenge her authority with actual legal knowledge. Wednesday night, I made the call that would change everything. Rapid response. Towing. This is Jake. Hi, Jake. This is Michael. Harrison on Maple Street in Willowbrook Estates. I wanted to ask about your policies for removing vehicles that are blocking private driveways. Jake turned out to be more than just a towing company owner. He was a guy who'd been dealing with HOA overreach in every neighborhood he worked. We talked for 20 minutes about property rights, blocking access, and the exact legal procedures for removing illegally parked vehicles from private property. Here's the thing, Jake explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been through this before. If someone blocks your driveway, that's not an HOA matter. That's trespassing and illegal parking. I can have a truck there in 15 minutes, any time of day. The owner pays all costs, and if they want their car back, they deal with me, not you. The beauty of it was elegant in its simplicity. Karen could create all the arbitrary HOA rules she wanted, but she couldn't override basic property law. My driveway was my private property, and blocking it was illegal regardless of whatever authority she thought she wielded. One more thing, Jake added before we hung up. Document everything. Time, date, photos, witnesses if you have them. Makes it all clean and legal. That conversation gave me something I hadn't felt in months: confidence. Karen's entire campaign of harassment was built on the assumption that she held all the power, that her HOA position made her untouchable. But she'd forgotten something fundamental. The law doesn't care about your HOA title if you're violating someone's actual legal rights. The rest of that week, I refined my strategy. Every move Karen made, I was already planning my countermove. Every threat she issued, I was documenting the legal violations. Every arbitrary rule she created, I was building the case that would eventually bring her down. Friday night, I sat in my home office surrounded by organized files of evidence, my key phone programmed with Jake's direct number, and a growing sense of anticipation. Karen thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. She was about to find out how wrong she was. The game had changed, and she had no idea that her next move, which I was certain would come soon, would be the one that finally gave me everything I needed to end this once and for all. She thought she was trapping me. She was actually walking straight into mine. The first neighbor knocked on my door at midnight. He whispered, "We've all been waiting for someone to stand up to her." I'd been working late in my office, organizing evidence and preparing for whatever Karen's next escalation might be when the soft knock came. Through the peephole, I could see Tom Martinez from 3 houses down, glancing nervously over his shoulder like he was worried about being watched. "Tom?" I opened the door, confused. "It's past midnight. Is everything okay?" He stepped inside quickly, barely waiting for my invitation. In the soft light of my hallway, I could see the stress lines around his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly as he ran them through his hair. "I know this is weird, coming here so late," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I saw your lights on, and, well, Maria and we've been talking about what Karen's been doing to you, and we think it's time someone knew the truth about what she's been doing to all of us." Over the next hour, sitting at my kitchen table with cups of coffee growing cold between us, Tom unraveled a story of systematic harassment that made my own experiences look mild by comparison. "It started 2 years ago," he explained. "Maria wanted to plant a vegetable garden in our backyard. Just tomatoes and peppers, nothing fancy. But Karen decided it was inappropriate agricultural use of residential property. She fined us $300 and threatened daily penalties until we removed it. The fine was bad enough, but it was the psychological campaign that followed that nearly broke them. Karen began inspecting their property weekly, always finding new violations. Their children's toys were improperly stored, if left on the lawn overnight. Their dogs barking during the day was disturbing the peace. Even their choice of porch furniture was deemed inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. The worst part, Tom continued, his voice getting tight with emotion, was what she did to Miguel. Their 8-year-old son had drawn chalk art on their driveway, a rainbow and some stick figures, the kind of innocent creativity every kid does. Karen had taken photos and issued a $150 fine for defacement of property. When Tom tried to argue that it was their own driveway and the chalk would wash away with the first rain, Karen had doubled the fine for contesting HOA authority. Miguel stopped playing outside after that. He was terrified he'd get us in trouble. Again. Tom's hands clenched into fists on the table. An 8-year-old boy. afraid to draw chalk pictures on his own driveway. But Tom wasn't the only one who'd been suffering in silence. Over the next few nights, more neighbors began approaching me, always late, always nervous, always checking to make sure Karen wasn't watching. Mrs. Chen came Tuesday night, carrying a manila envelope thick with violation notices. Her crime? Wind chimes on her back porch that Karen claimed were noise pollution, despite the fact that they were barely audible from the street. The fines had totaled over $800 before Mrs. Chen finally took them down, and even then, Karen had continued to harass her about potential noise violations from her air conditioning unit. The Hendersons knocked on my door Wednesday, looking exhausted and defeated. They'd been through 3 different paint colors on their house in 2 years, each time forced to repaint when Karen decided the previous color was non-compliant. The latest violation was for their rose bushes, which Karen claimed attracted too many bees and therefore posed a safety risk to the neighborhood. "We've spent over $4,000 in fines and forced improvements," Mrs. Henderson said, tears in her eyes. "We're considering selling the house just to get away from her." By Thursday, I realized I was sitting at the center of an underground resistance movement I'd never known existed. Neighbors who'd been too intimidated to speak up individually were finding courage in numbers, sharing stories and evidence they'd been collecting in secret. The breakthrough came when Mr. Peterson arrived at my door Friday evening. I'd always seen him as one of Karen's victims, the elderly widower who'd been fined for Halloween decorations and seemed too frail to fight back. But what he carried with him changed everything. "I used to be on the HOA board," he said, settling carefully into my kitchen chair. "Before Karen, back when we actually followed the rules." He opened a worn briefcase and pulled out files that made my eyes widen. Original HOA charter documents, board meeting minutes from Karen's first year, financial records, even recorded phone conversations from when he'd tried to oppose her early power grabs. "She forced me out by making my life hell," Peterson explained. "But I kept records of everything, every illegal vote, every rule she created without proper authority, every time she exceeded the board's actual powers. The documents were devastating. Meeting minutes that showed Karen bulldozing other board members, creating emergency policies without proper votes, and systematically eliminating anyone who questioned her authority. Financial records that suggested questionable use of HOA funds for her personal enforcement activities. Most damning of all, recordings of Karen explicitly stating that she intended to break residents who opposed her. "Why didn't you ever use these?" I asked, spreading the papers across my table. Peterson's smile was bitter. Who was I going to report her to? The board she controlled? The management company she'd hired? I was one old man against her entire system. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp despite his age. "But you're not alone anymore, are you?" That weekend, my house became the unofficial headquarters of what we started calling the Willowbrook Resistance. Neighbors brought evidence, shared stories, and for the first time in years, began to feel like they had some power against Karen's tyranny. Maria Martinez contributed photos of Karen trespassing on their property to measure their grass. The Chens had recorded audio of Karen threatening them with legal action over their garden decorations. Even quiet Mrs. Patterson from the end of the street showed up with a notebook, documenting every time Karen had harassed her about her cat. But the real game-changer came from an unexpected source. Sunday evening, as our informal meeting was winding down, there was another knock at my door. This time it was Jennifer Walsh, Karen's former real estate partner, looking nervous but determined. "I worked with Karen for 3 years before I couldn't take it anymore," she said. "I know things about how she really operates, about some of the questionable things she's done to force people out of the neighborhood." Jennifer's information was pure gold. email chains showing Karen coordinating harassment campaigns against residents she wanted gone, records of property damage she'd caused and covered up. Most shocking of all, evidence that Karen had been using her real estate connections to manipulate property values and force out homeowners who couldn't afford her escalating fines. She's not just power-hungry, Jennifer explained. She's been systematically driving out certain residents so her friends can buy their houses below market value. It's borderline illegal and definitely unethical. As the neighbors finally left that night, I sat surrounded by boxes of evidence, recordings, photographs, and documentation that painted a picture of corruption and abuse that went far beyond petty HOA harassment. We had enough material to not just stop Karen's campaign against me, but to bring down her entire operation. But more importantly, we had something Karen had tried so hard to destroy: unity. For the first time in years, the neighbors of Willowbrook Estates were working together instead of cowering separately. She'd created her own opposition through the very tactics she'd used to maintain power. Monday morning, I watched through my window as Karen's silver Escalade made its usual surveillance run past my house. She had no idea that behind the curtains of a dozen homes, neighbors were watching her with cameras, taking notes, building the case that would finally bring her reign of terror to an end. The resistance was ready. And then the day came when she made her biggest mistake. Her SUV blocked my driveway again, only this time I was ready. Within minutes, the tow truck's headlights cut through the morning fog. It was exactly 3 weeks after our first confrontation when Karen decided to make her boldest move yet. I was in my kitchen, finishing my morning coffee and reviewing the evidence files one more time, when I heard the familiar rumble of her Escalade outside. Through the window, I watched her execute the same deliberate maneuver as before. Positioning her SUV perpendicular across my driveway, engine running, blocking my exit completely. But this time was different. This time, I was ready. My phone was already in my hand, Jake's number on speed dial. The security cameras were rolling, automatically uploading to cloud storage. And scattered throughout the neighborhood, I knew at least 6 neighbors were probably watching from their windows, some with cameras of their own. Rapid response. Towing. This is Jake. Jake, it's Michael Harrison. She's back. Same spot. Exactly the same. Silver Escalade, license plate. I rattled off the number I'd memorized weeks ago. On my way. 15 minutes. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside, my heart hammering but my mind calm. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. Karen was standing beside her SUV in her usual pose, arms crossed, designer sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. But something was different about her today. There was an edge of desperation in her posture, a tightness around her mouth that suggested she knew she was losing control and was making increasingly reckless moves to reassert her dominance. "Good morning, Karen," I said, my voice steady and calm as I approached. "Blocking my driveway again, I see." She pushed her sunglasses up onto her head, and I could see the fury burning in her eyes. "We need to talk, Michael. This little rebellion of yours ends today." "Rebellion?" I pulled out my phone, making sure she could see me checking the time. "I'm just a homeowner trying to get to work, and you're illegally parked on my private property." "Don't you dare lecture me about legality," she hissed, stepping closer. "I am the HOA president. I decide what's legal in this neighborhood." That's when I heard it, the low rumble of a diesel engine getting closer. Jake's tow truck turned the corner, its yellow emergency lights already flashing, the hydraulic boom gleaming in the morning sun like some mechanical instrument of justice. Karen's face went white as she registered what was happening. "You wouldn't dare." "Actually, I would. I gestured toward the approaching truck. That's what happens when you illegally block someone's driveway. Your car gets towed at your expense. The tow truck pulled up with a hydraulic hiss of air brakes, and Jake climbed out. A mountain of a man in coveralls, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. He surveyed the situation with professional efficiency. "This the vehicle?" he asked, jerking a thumb toward Karen's Escalade. "That's the one. Blocking my driveway, engine running, owner present and refusing to move." Jake nodded and started walking around the SUV, documenting its position with his phone camera. The sound of his boots on the pavement seemed unnaturally loud in the morning, quiet. "Wait!" Karen's voice cracked with panic. "You can't do this! I'm the HOA president." Jake paused and looked at her with the patient expression of someone who'd heard every excuse in the book. "Ma'am, I don't care if you're the Queen of England. This vehicle is illegally parked on private property. Owners requesting removal." By now, curtains were twitching in windows throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen had come out to retrieve her newspaper and was lingering by her mailbox. Tom Martinez was walking his dog, moving suspiciously slowly past our houses. Even Mr. Peterson had emerged onto his porch, coffee mug in hand. Karen seemed to realize she had an audience, and it triggered something primal in her. The desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed authority was crumbling in public view. "This is harassment!" she screamed, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "I am conducting official HOA business. You cannot interfere with HOA authority." I pulled out the manila folder I'd been carrying and handed her a document. "Actually, Karen, you might want to read this. It's a cease and desist letter regarding your pattern of harassment, documented violations of HOA charter procedures, and illegal enforcement activities." Her hands shook as she opened the folder, scanning the legal language that detailed every violation she'd committed, every rule she'd created without proper authority, every fine she'd levied beyond the HOA's chartered powers. "This is—" she started, then stopped, her face cycling through emotions: rage, fear, disbelief, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. Behind her, Jake had connected the chains to her SUV and was operating the hydraulic controls. The Escalade's front wheels lifted slowly off the ground with mechanical precision, accompanied by the steady grinding of gears and the hiss of hydraulic fluid. "Put it down!" Karen shrieked, abandoning any pretense of dignity. "Put my car down, right now!" "Ma'am, you'll need to discuss that with the impound office," Jake replied calmly. "Address and phone number are on this receipt." He handed her a pink slip of paper. The sound of smartphone cameras clicking was audible now. Several neighbors were openly filming the spectacle, some not even trying to be discreet about it. Karen's public humiliation was being documented from multiple angles, and she knew it. That's when she made her final, fatal mistake. "I'll destroy you for this," she screamed, her voice echoing off the houses. "I'll fine you into bankruptcy. I'll put liens on your property. I'll make your life so miserable you'll beg to leave this neighborhood." The threats hung in the air like smoke, witnessed by half the street and recorded on multiple devices. In her rage, Karen had just provided the final piece of evidence we needed: a public admission of her intent to abuse her HOA position for personal revenge. Jake finished securing the SUV and climbed back into his truck cab. "She's ready to go," he called out the window. "Impound lots on 5th Street. They open at 8. As the tow truck pulled away with Karen's silver Escalade dangling from its boom, she stood in the middle of the street looking smaller and more pathetic than I'd ever seen her. The perfectly coiffed hair was disheveled, the designer clothes wrinkled, The authoritative posture collapsed into something that looked almost fragile. The neighbors who'd gathered began to disperse, but not before several approached me with words of support. Mrs. Chen squeezed my arm and whispered, "Thank you." Tom Martinez gave me a thumbs up. Even quiet, Mrs. Patterson smiled and nodded approvingly. But it was Mr. Peterson's words that stayed with me as Karen finally stormed off toward her house, her heels clicking furiously on the asphalt. 30 years I've lived on this street, he said, his old eyes bright with something that looked like hope. That's the first time I've ever seen her look afraid. As I watched the tow truck disappear around the corner, Karen's SUV swaying slightly with the movement, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of victory exactly, but the peace that comes from finally standing up to a bully and discovering they're not as powerful as they pretended to be. The war wasn't over yet. Karen would undoubtedly try to retaliate. But something fundamental had shifted that morning. The Queen of Willowbrook Estates had been publicly challenged and publicly humiliated, and everyone had seen her for what she really was. Not an untouchable authority figure, but just another person who'd been drunk on power for too long. Her car was gone, but more importantly, her aura of invincibility was gone with it. By the next morning, Karen's power began to unravel faster than anyone could have imagined. I woke up to 17 text messages, 12 voicemails, and the sound of someone knocking insistently on my front door. Through the window, I could see Tom Martinez on my porch, practically bouncing with excitement. "You need to see this," he said the moment I opened the door, shoving his phone into my hands. The screen showed our neighborhood's Facebook page, usually a sleepy forum for lost cat notices and garage sale announcements. But today, it was exploding with activity. Someone had posted the video of Karen's meltdown, and it was spreading like wildfire. "Look at the comments," Tom urged. Dozens of neighbors were sharing their own stories. Mrs. Henderson posted photos of all the paint samples she'd been forced to try under Karen's arbitrary color rules. The Garcias had uploaded pictures of their destroyed mailbox with a detailed account of Karen's middle-of-the-night demolition. Even neighbors I'd never spoken to were coming forward with tales of harassment, illegal fines, and abuse of power. But the real bombshell was buried halfway down the comment thread. Jennifer Walsh, Karen's former real estate partner, had posted a detailed account of Karen's behind-the-scenes manipulations, complete with email screenshots showing Karen coordinating with investors to pressure homeowners into selling below market value. "It's not just our neighborhood," Tom said, scrolling through the responses. People from Oakwood Estates and Sunset Gardens are sharing similar stories. Apparently, Karen's reputation extends further than we thought. By 9 a.m., my phone was ringing off the hook. A reporter from the local newspaper wanted to interview me about HOA abuse in suburban neighborhoods. A lawyer specializing in property law was offering to represent anyone who'd been illegally fined. Most surprisingly, a county commissioner's office was requesting copies of our documentation for a review of HOA oversight procedures. But it was the 10 a.m. call that changed everything. "Mr. Harrison? This is Sandra Williams from the Willowbrook HOA Management Company. I need to speak with you about some very serious allegations that have been brought to our attention." The management company had been contacted by multiple residents and were launching an immediate investigation into Karen's conduct. They wanted copies of all our documentation: the illegal fines, the fabricated rules, the harassment campaigns, everything. "I have to tell you," Sandra said, her voice tight with professional concern, "what I'm seeing here could result in the entire board being dissolved and reconstituted. We're talking about potential legal action financial restitution, and complete organizational restructuring. By noon, the first HOA board member had resigned, then another. By evening, 4 of the 5 board members had stepped down, leaving Karen isolated and facing calls for her immediate removal. But Karen wasn't going quietly. At 6 p.m., I found another violation notice on my door. This one more vicious than anything she'd done before. $2,000 in emergency fines for disrupting community peace, inciting resident rebellion, and my personal favorite, coordinating unauthorized towing services on HOA property. The problem for Karen was that everyone was watching now. Within an hour of posting that notice, I had photos from 3 different neighbors who'd witnessed her trespassing on my property to tape it up. The local news crew that had been interviewing residents caught wind of it and showed up at her door for comment. The video of that encounter went viral beyond our little neighborhood. Karen, caught off guard and defensive, denied any wrongdoing while simultaneously threatening the reporters with legal action for trespassing on public sidewalks. Her paranoid, aggressive responses only made her look more unhinged. "This is all lies," she screamed at the camera. "These people are just jealous of my authority. I've maintained property values. I've kept this neighborhood respectable." But her words rang hollow when juxtaposed with the testimonies of neighbors describing years of harassment, illegal fines, and systematic abuse of power. Wednesday brought the emergency HOA meeting that everyone had been demanding. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds standing outside. Karen sat alone at the front table, looking smaller and more isolated than ever, while faced with a room full of residents who were no longer afraid of her. Mr. Peterson, energized by the crowd support, stood up and delivered a 20-minute presentation, detailing Karen's violations of the HOA charter. He had documentation, recordings, and financial records that painted a devastating picture of corruption and overreach. "This woman," he concluded, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "has turned our community from a neighborhood into a dictatorship. She's violated our trust, exceeded her authority, and systematically harassed residents for her own psychological satisfaction." The vote was unanimous. Karen Westfield was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. But the real moment of justice came during the financial review. The management company's audit revealed that Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, hiring private investigators to watch problem residents, paying for legal services to intimidate homeowners, even purchasing surveillance equipment for her personal harassment campaigns. The total misappropriation exceeded $15,000, all documented in receipts and invoices that Karen had been careless enough to submit for reimbursement. What she'd thought was untouchable authority had actually created a paper trail of her own crimes. Thursday morning, I watched from my kitchen window as a police car pulled up in front of Karen's house. The charges weren't just HOA-related anymore. They involved fraud, harassment, and misuse of funds. Serious legal consequences that could include fines, restitution, and even jail time. As the officer escorted Karen to the patrol car, I felt an unexpected wave of sadness. Not for her. She'd earned every consequence coming her way. But for the time and energy wasted, the stress she'd inflicted on so many good people, the community spirit she'd nearly destroyed with her need to control everything around her. The afternoon brought one final twist. A process server arrived at my door with legal documents, but not the kind I was expecting. Karen was being sued by multiple residents for harassment, property damage, and civil rights violations. The lawyer who'd called earlier was representing a class action that could result in Karen paying tens of thousands in damages. But perhaps the sweetest justice was the simplest. That evening, For the first time in years, I saw children playing in the street, drawing chalk art on driveways, laughing without looking over their shoulders. The Garcias were installing a new mailbox, a beautiful custom design that would have sent Karen into a rage just days before. The reign of terror was over. The neighborhood was healing, and Karen Westfield, the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates, was facing the consequences of her own actions at last. The street was quiet again. No SUV, no notices, no watchful eyes. For the first time in years, it actually felt like home. 6 months later, I was sitting on my front porch on a warm Saturday evening, watching the Martinez kids ride their bikes in the street while their parents grilled burgers in their backyard. The Chens had put their wind chimes back up, creating a gentle melody that mixed with the sound of laughter from the Hendersons' grandchildren visiting for the weekend. Mr. Peterson was tending his garden, finally free to plant whatever flowers he wanted without fear of arbitrary violation notices. It was everything a neighborhood should be: peaceful, friendly, alive with the kind of community spirit that Karen had spent years trying to crush. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The new HOA board, elected by overwhelming margins and committed to actual democratic governance, had spent months undoing Karen's damage. They'd rescinded dozens of illegal rules, refunded thousands of dollars in bogus fines, and established proper procedures for any future rule changes that required actual resident input and approval. The management company had implemented oversight, procedures to prevent another Karen situation. Board meetings were recorded and live-streamed. Financial records were publicly available. Most importantly, residents now knew their rights and weren't afraid to exercise them. But the real change was psychological. People weren't afraid anymore. They talked to each other, shared concerns openly, and worked together to maintain their community instead of cowering separately behind closed doors. The fear-based isolation that Karen had cultivated was replaced by genuine neighborhood cooperation. For Karen herself, justice had been thorough, but not vindictive. The criminal charges resulted in probation, community service, and full restitution of the misappropriated HOA funds. The civil lawsuits were settled out of court, requiring her to pay substantial damages to the residents she'd harassed. But perhaps the most fitting consequence was the court-ordered restriction preventing her from holding any HOA position for 10 years. She'd finally sold her house and moved away 3 months after her removal from office. I'd watched from my window as the moving truck loaded up her belongings, including that silver Escalade she'd used as a weapon of intimidation for so many years. She never looked back at the neighborhood she'd terrorized, and I suspect she never thought about the damage she'd caused to so many people's lives. The evening air carried the scent of barbecue smoke and freshly cut grass as I reflected on everything that had happened. The confrontation that started with a blocked driveway had turned into something much bigger. A lesson about the nature of power, the importance of standing up to bullies, and the strength that comes from community solidarity. I thought about that first morning when I'd found her SUV blocking my driveway, and how hopeless the situation had seemed. Karen had appeared so powerful, so untouchable, protected by her official title and the fear she'd instilled in everyone around her. But power based on fear and intimidation is ultimately fragile. It only works as long as people accept it. The moment I decided to fight back, to document her abuses and rally the neighbors she'd victimized, her entire system began to collapse. She'd built her authority on the assumption that no one would ever challenge her with facts, evidence, and legal knowledge. When someone finally did, her house of cards crumbled almost immediately. Tom Martinez walked over with a beer in his hand, settling into the chair next to mine. "Hard to believe it's the same street," he said, watching his son, Miguel, drawing elaborate chalk murals on their driveway without a care in the world. "You know what I learned from all this?" I said, accepting the cold bottle he offered. "Bullies like Karen count on good people staying isolated and afraid. The moment we started working together, she lost her power." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the life of a healthy neighborhood unfold around us. Mrs. Chen was teaching the Patterson girls how to hang proper wind chimes. The Hendersons were sharing tomatoes from their garden with anyone who wanted them. Even quiet Mrs. Patterson had joined a group of neighbors planning a community block party, something that would have been unthinkable under Karen's reign. The sun was setting behind the oak trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when Tom asked the question I'd been thinking about for months. "Do you think she learned anything from all this?" I considered the question seriously. Did Karen understand that her downfall was the inevitable result of her own actions? Did she recognize the damage she'd caused to people's lives and peace of mind? Did she feel any remorse for turning a community into her personal kingdom of fear? Probably not, I admitted. People like Karen rarely take responsibility for the harm they cause. She probably still thinks she was the victim, that we were the unreasonable ones for not accepting her authority. "That's the saddest part," Tom said. "She could have been a good leader if she'd actually cared about the community, instead of just controlling it." As the streetlights came on and neighbors began calling their children inside for dinner, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not just because we'd won, but because we'd proven something important about the power of ordinary people to stand up for what's right. Karen had blocked my driveway thinking she was trapping me, forcing me to submit to her will or face escalating consequences. Instead, she'd pushed too far and given me the opportunity to rally every neighbor she'd ever harassed into a unified resistance movement. She'd wanted to make me an example of what happened to people who defied her authority. Instead, she'd made herself an example of what happens to petty tyrants who mistake fear for respect and power for leadership. The lesson wasn't just about HOAs or neighborhood disputes. It was about something fundamental to human nature. The way bullies operate, the psychology of abuse, and the incredible power that comes from people working together against injustice. As I finished my beer and prepared to head inside, I took one last look at the peaceful street that had once been a battlefield. Children's laughter echoed in the evening air, neighbors chatted across fence lines, and the warm glow of porch lights created a sense of safety and community that Karen had tried so hard to destroy. She'd taught us all an important lesson, though not the one she'd intended. She'd shown us that standing up to bullies, even ones with official titles and manufactured authority, isn't just possible. It's necessary. And when good people finally decide to work together instead of suffering alone, even the most entrenched tyrant can be brought down. Karen blocked my driveway to trap me. Instead, she cleared the way for all of us to finally live free.